Okay, would you go into a little bit of detail about your formal and/or technical um, arrangement, possibly both in your novels and in your poetry? What kind of um, consideration do you give to um, how the formal aspects are arranged, or are they more of an afterthought um, after your initial inspirational impulse has been uh, laid down?
Um, as far as I mean, like the structure of a novel or something.
Yes, structure. That was the word I was
Um,
missing.
um, like a novel, if you're writing, if you're any good, the structure simply comes out of the story organically. Um, it's I mean, there are writers who have come in with big grand plans as to how they're going to structure something, and sometimes they really work well. Um, Something like Lawrence Durrell's Alexandria Quartet, where he had a big idea about um, fragmenting time and perception, etc., etc., and it worked really, really well. Most of the time, it doesn't work very, very well. I think it comes out of whatever story you have to tell. Heaping Stones, for example, was a very direct, angry story, and so it needed a very simple, direct structure. Um, the new stuff, the Backwaters novels, are pretty straightforward as well. Um, but they do need to take in more characters and more things like in more situations. So um, they're a little more diffuse, but I don't really ever go into a novel planning a structure. Um, it just never. I don't think of it in that terms. A structure will emerge early, and then you follow it. At least I do. That's how it works.
Okay.
Poetry's totally different, though. Poetry just structures itself completely. Um, it's I couldn't like I always use this example. Poetry is born, whereas prose is built,
Okay.
and you can't. I can't anyways. If it just either happens or it doesn't. And later I can understand. Okay, this is what I'm trying to do. This is how it worked. Okay, this is why this and such works. Okay, this is why this line break is here, or why this stanza is the way it is. Whatever. But it's always an afterthought. There is no, as far as structure goes, there's no plan going in.
Okay.
Actually, there is occasionally, and it's usually really, really, really bad writing when I do that.
Okay. Well, coming from you know the standpoint of a musician, standpoint, is that even a word? Um, Coming from the
Perspective.
perspective, I need help with words. See, that's why I do the music and you do the words. The perspective of a musician, and certain composers, for example, Liszt, tended to be his works tended to be through composed. You know, he'd work from beginning to end, but like you said, the underlying structure would emerge over the course of that. Whereas composers, for instance, Arnold Schoenberg, you know, certainly a more modern composer than Liszt, um, had a specific structure or a framework that he worked with. However, by his own admission, he was ultimately able to attain that framework without even thinking about it. But some of his later disciples actually would complete the framework well before actually doing the composition. And I think, if I understand you correctly, you're saying um, that your work comes more out of the model where the framework um, becomes apparent once you're done, that your attempts to try and pre-structure something don't seem to work, and in fact, in authors that you've observed, that doesn't work either. Um, that it the process, in your own words, really has to be organic for it to ultimately be a
Mm-hmm.
satisfying
Yeah,
work.
it's also subconscious because you read enough and you write enough over the years. You understand instinctively what works and what doesn't work, and you don't maybe while you're writing a paragraph or a chapter, you don't see that you're structuring things in a certain way, but you've just known why things work and don't work. You don't have to read too many bad novels to understand why they're bad. And you can, if you have any ability, you will avoid that. And so it's subconscious. I mean, but it's there.
Right.
It's from your learning. So I suppose, I think when you talk about people pre-structuring things like that, you're talking about the disciples of Liszt, I think you mentioned, doing things.
Schoenberg, yeah.
Schoenberg, excuse me, doing things like that. I think they've missed the point. They're essentially, it's like, I don't know, it's kind of like spending more time working on your wine bottle and label than actually working on the wine.
Right.
You know, and that's kind of where they're at. This doesn't work. It just simply doesn't. I mean, for me.
Right.
With certain exception, you know.
Yeah.
But even something like that, I would say, is there's a subconscious thing. Back to the example of Lawrence Darrow, something like the Alexandria Quartet. He did have this big arching plan going in, but I think he also had this he talked about the story bubbling inside him for 15 years or something, so he had an organic idea of what the story was going to be that was forming naturally, and I think his idea of the big structure was probably something that was coming out of this, something that in a sense was already written in his head. And so in a way he wasn't structuring things from the outside, he was simply creating a framework for things to flow into that he knew he had to create because that's where they're going to flow anyways. So
Okay.
that's my opinion of it anyways.
So would you ever have some kind of framework just as a way of maybe getting your thoughts and or your characters in order so that you can avoid inconsistencies or that sort of thing, or does that do you seem to be able to avoid that sort of thing just by nature of working through your story? Do you ever look at the end and have a character, I mean, an extreme example was like, a character that died early on and all of a sudden they're doing something at the end. Obviously that wouldn't really happen, but that sort of thing where someone did something that was totally antithetical to the original character that you had built up.
Because if your characters at any point start doing things that don't make sense, you've gone off track of your story. You establish your characters in a few pages when they're first there and the situation they're in. Well, if your protagonist is in such and such a situation, well, the other characters have to be in certain types. It doesn't work. The situation wouldn't exist. And so you work from that. If their characters are wrong, it means your situation's wrong and your whole book is a lie.
Right.